In your kit this month, you have 23 assorted fabrics. Now, the first thing I do every month before I do anything else is I use either magic sizing or best press, or you could use spray starch. I spray my pieces just so they're damp, and I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it on the camera. So I just spray it till they're damp, and I press it dry with an iron. And pressing is an up and down motion, not a back and forth. I do not want to stretch this out of square, so I'm just going to press it dry. And this does a couple things for us. It makes our fabric crisper so we can get more accurate cuts, and it also keeps any bias from stretching to a certain extent. If you really pull on it, it will still stretch. And the other thing that we found it did a few years ago, and one of our mysteries, was it takes care of pre-shrinking the fabric. We had some pieces that shrank up quite a bit, so pressing it dry will take some of the shrink out so you don't get a surprise later. Out of all 23 of these rectangles, we are going to ultimately need 2.5-inch squares. So you can either just cut the 2.5-inch squares, or I'm going to do it a little different, but no matter what you do, I'm always starting out by clean cutting one edge, and you can actually do one end too if you want to. And I tend to cut with pieces stacked up. I only have 2 right now, but I'll go up to 4. Now, if I'm doing that, I really should have it on a smaller mat or in a position where I can walk around. I can't where I am right now, and I didn't get a smaller mat out, so I'm going to turn that. I don't recommend that. And then I'm going to line my 2.5-inch mark up with the edge that I just clean cut. Now, you will get more accurate cuts if you are centered in front of what you're cutting. I'm not always centered when I'm on camera because the camera's in the way. So I have a line here, and I'm going to cut. Now, I could have clean cut one edge too, but what I've decided to do is not cut these down to 2.5 inches. I'm just going to cut my strips in half to start. So it should be better than 2.5 inches. It's actually going to be about 3. And the reason I'm doing that is then after I sew my strips together, I can cut that strip down to 2.5 inches. So I'm going to do that on all my pieces. If you wanted to, you can go ahead and cut it to your 2.5 inches, in which case you would need to clean up one of the short ends and then cut it to 2.5 inches square. So it's up to you. Get that ruler out of there with the light. But I'm just going to do the same thing to all of them. I'm going to cut my strips to 2.5 inches wide, and I'm just cutting them in half. I'm going to take these rectangles that I've cut, and I'm going to arrange them into 15 rows of 3 each, and obviously I don't have all 15 here. You just can arrange them however you want, and just because I do the rows, I have them set out here, doesn't mean that's where I'm going to put them when I'm done. Once I have figured out what I want in each row, I'm going to sew them right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the long edge. Remember, I didn't cut the short edges yet. And just sew my rows of 3 together, or my columns. Accuracy is going to be important in this quilt, but rather than spend a lot of time in this video talking about it, I recorded a video a couple years ago that talks about different things that can help you with your accuracy. So I will be moving it into the playlist for this year's First Thursday, and you can go watch that if you have issues with accuracy. I talk about needles, thread, presser feet, how to get your accurate 1/4. So I'm just going to go and sew all 15 rows of 3 together, and then I will come back. I've stitched all 15 of my columns together. Let me mention, since I didn't before I went to do it, I do shorten my stitch length to a 2.0 on my sewing machine. That makes it a little more sturdy. It also means it will be harder to rip out. I use a neutral thread. I'm using kind of a light tan for this quilt. You could use gray. And I have tested, so I know where my accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance is. I do like a Microtex needle. You could use a universal. The Microtex is a sharp needle, while the universal is a cross between a sharp needle and a ballpoint needle. And I do chain piece, so it's just one piece right after another. There's a few reasons for chain piecing. 1, it's faster. 2, it saves thread. And 3, I'm more accurate when I do chain piecing, because when I'm feeding one piece right after another in, I'm less likely to swerve at the beginning or the end. So once it's all sewn together, we need to press it. And full disclosure, I've already pressed it, but I'm going to demo here with my little iron. The first thing I do when I'm pressing is to press my seam as it was sewn, so just flat, and that sets my seam. If you don't believe me, try tearing out a seam that hasn't been pressed versus one that has been pressed and set that way. So once it's pressed, then I'm going to flip up my piece that I'm going to press, and I usually use my fingers to smooth it, and it's an up and down motion with my iron, not a back and forth. I don't want to stretch this out. Now with these, I figured out what arrangement I wanted. I used my phone. Once I had it arranged, I took a picture so I don't have to worry about arranging it again. So I know how it's going back together. Now, because I didn't choose to trim my pieces down to 2.5 inches square when I started, all of these strips are going to need to be cut down to 2.5 inches. So if you want to, you can cut your squares 2.5 inches and sew them together, and then you wouldn't have to do this trimming step. I just find that I get a straighter edge if I do it this way. So it's up to you. It doesn't really matter. Our piece should be 6.5 inches this way, and I'm within a thread or two of that, so I'm fine with that. If you were way off, then you might need to tear it out and redo it. So when I'm trimming something like this, I just want to shave off a small amount on one side, and to keep everything straight, I'm lining marks up with my seams and also with my cut edges down here, because these were my straight edges that I cut. And it would be helpful if I said it. So I'm going to clean cut that edge, and I have it on a small mat, which I could either pick up and move, or this one is actually a rotating mat, so I'm just going to rotate it. But a small mat means you can pick it up and move it without disturbing it. And now I want to put my 2.5 inch mark on my cut edge, and again I'm going to line up marks with my seams and my two ends to keep everything straight. And when I'm satisfied that I have it as good as I can get it, then I'm going to trim off the other edge. So by doing this, I get nice straight edges. Sometimes when you're sewing a bunch of squares together, you'll start getting little staggers in there. So doing it this way avoids that. But you can cut, like the pattern says, your 2.5 inch squares and just put them together. So I need to trim down all 15 of my short rows. I forgot one thing. Before you start pressing, you will need to decide what your arrangement is, because if you press your odd rows, the seams up, then you want to press your even rows with the seams down, or just the opposite. If your odd rows were down, then your even rows would be up. We just want every other row for the seams to be going opposite directions. So now I'm going to take my rows to the sewing machine, and because my rows are going in opposite directions, when I put them together they kind of nest, so they kind of lock in there so my intersections match up, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that edge. So I will just put all 15 rows together. I have my 15 rows sewn together, and you can't see all of it in this video. As you're sewing, when you sew 2 of them together, you might want to stop, press it, and check, because with just 2 of them sewn together, they should be 4.5 inches. Those 2 should be 4.5 inches wide. If they're not, you may want to go adjust. So tear that seam out and either make it wider or narrower, rather than sewing the whole thing together and then realizing that you have a problem. It's going to be important that it be 30.5 inches when it's finished. So for the pressing, we're going to just press our seams to one side. So to do that, again, I'm going to press as sewn, so up and down. And I didn't do it with this iron. And then press this way and this way. Now if I want it to really lay flat, I can give it a shot of steam, and that is fine if you have already done the spray with your best press or your magic sizing, because the shrinkage has been taken out of it. But if you don't do that and you do a shot of steam, you may have seen where you get puckers. That's the fabric shrinking. I didn't get any puckers. So I gave it a shot of steam. And then if you want those seams to be really flat, then you can put something heavy on top of it, like a phone book or a dictionary. Or if you have done any tailoring, if you have a clapper board, or I use the bottom of my pointer board, I sit it on there and I will hold it down if I'm using the pointer board until my steam has dried. So until that's dry. So that gives me nice flat seams, and I can really check to make sure that everything came out right. So should be 6.5 high by 30.5 wide. Just real quick, your options. If you don't want to oversize in width your pieces and sew them together and then trim, you can cut all your pieces to 2.5 inches before you start. Then you would save a little bit of time on that trimming. No matter what you do, you are going to end up with one extra piece because we have 46, basically 2.5 inch squares. So take your pick which one you don't want. Now I did consider just trimming my strips, and I haven't trimmed these yet, to 2.5 inches. Let's move this out of the way. And just sewing, after they're trimmed, sewing 3 of them together. That would mean then that I would clean cut one edge, cut a 2.5 inch strip, and another 2.5 inch strip. The drawback with that, for me, was that meant I had 2 strips that were exactly the same. And also, I have an odd number, so I would have to fuss with it at the end because I would be short one 3 inch or 3 section piece, and I would have 2 pieces, so I would have to play with it at the end to get it to come out. So I've given you options. There is no one right way, which pretty much any time you take a class from me you will hear there's always more than one way to do something. So you need to find the way that works best for you and go with that.